My family cut me off after Dad died. A decade later, I controlled the inheritance. The rain hammered against the windshield as I sat in my aging Honda Civic, parked 3 blocks away from Riverside Memorial Chapel in Rochester, New York. Through the gray curtain of October rain, I could barely make out the figures in black gathering at the entrance. My family. My mother, Margaret. My older brother, David. My sister, Christine. Cousins, aunts, uncles. People who'd known me my entire life. And not one of them had told me my father was dead. I'd found out 3 days after he passed, scrolling through Facebook at 11 p.m. in my studio apartment. A cousin's post, "Rest in peace, Uncle Robert. You were loved by so many." The comments flooded in. Condolences. Memories. Photos I'd never seen. I called my mother immediately. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. "Mom, is it true? Is Dad?" "Michael." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "This doesn't concern you." "What do you mean it doesn't concern me? He was my father. You made your choices 10 years ago. We made ours." The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, staring at my phone, trying to understand. 10 years ago, yes, I'd walked away. I'd refused to be part of the endless family drama, the manipulation, the way they all fed off each other's worst impulses. I'd moved to Buffalo, taken a job as a paralegal, built a quiet life. I'd sent Christmas cards, birthday texts, all ignored. But this, being excluded from my own father's funeral? Now watching them file into the chapel, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. David was wearing Dad's watch, the vintage Rolex Dad had promised me when I turned 16. Christine had Mom's arm, playing the dutiful daughter, though I knew she'd barely visited Dad in his final years. And there, greeting mourners at the door like he owned the place, was Uncle Carl, Dad's younger brother, the family lawyer. The same Uncle Carl who'd once told me, drunk at a Christmas party, that Dad's estate was more complicated than you'd think, kid. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Instead, I drove back to Buffalo through the rain, my mind replaying every conversation I'd had with my father before I left. He'd understood why I needed distance. "Sometimes," he'd said, "you have to save yourself first, Michael." I get that. Had he known what they'd do? The next week I received a single document in the mail. No letter. No explanation. Just a formal notification from Carl's law firm that my father's estate was being settled. And as I had voluntarily separated from the family, I was not listed as a beneficiary. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking. Voluntarily separated. As if I'd abandoned him. As if I'd chosen this. I called Carl's office. His secretary was polite but firm. "Mr. Harrison has asked that all estate matters be handled through formal channels. If you wish to contest, you'll need to hire your own attorney." With what money? I was 28, working 60-hour weeks to cover rent and student loans. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Dad's last birthday card to me, sent 2 years earlier before they'd convinced him to stop. Inside, in his shaky handwriting, "Never forget who you are, son. That's what matters most." I decided then that I wouldn't fight them. Not yet. That I'd learn. I enrolled in night classes at the university at Buffalo Law School. I read everything I could about estate law, probate, trusts, and the loopholes families exploited. I became obsessed not with revenge but with understanding. How had they done it? How had they erased me so completely? My supervisor at the paralegal firm, an older woman named Dorothy, noticed the law books on my desk. "Estate planning?" she asked. "Family stuff," I said quietly. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The worst battles are always family. Just remember, the law doesn't care about feelings. It cares about documentation." Documentation. That word would change everything. Buffalo in winter is brutal. The wind off Lake Erie cuts through everything, and the snow piles up until the city becomes a maze of gray slush and frozen determination. But I liked it. The cold kept me focused. For 10 years I lived a life my family knew nothing about. I worked. I studied. I became an expert in something they never saw coming. I understood exactly how they'd manipulated Dad's estate, and I learned how to undo it. By year 3 I'd passed the New York State Bar exam. By year 5 I was working for a mid-sized estate planning firm in downtown Buffalo, handling cases that mirrored my own story. Families torn apart by greed, children erased by forged signatures and coercive tactics. I never married. Never had kids. I lived in the same modest apartment in the Elmwood Village, drove the same car, and kept my expenses minimal. Every spare dollar went into a legal defense fund. Not for me but for a case I knew was coming. Because I'd discovered something in year 2 that changed everything. Late one night, going through Dad's papers that I'd saved, old tax returns, property deeds I'd copied before leaving, I found a discrepancy. A property in the Adirondacks. A small cabin on Lake George that Dad had inherited from his father, my grandfather Thomas. The property wasn't mentioned in the estate settlement Carl had filed. I drove to Lake George on a freezing Saturday in January, following a memory from childhood. Dad had taken me there once, just the two of us, when I was 12. We'd fished. Talked about life. He told me, "This place is special, Michael. One day it'll be yours." The cabin was still there, hidden down a private road, surrounded by snow-covered pines. And posted on the door was a notice: property taxes delinquent. Scheduled for county auction. They'd forgotten about it, or ignored it, or assumed it wasn't worth the trouble. But I knew better. I paid the back taxes, $14,000 I'd saved over 4 years. The county clerk looked at me with surprise when I showed up with the cashier's check. "You sure about this?" he asked. "It's just an old cabin." "It was my grandfather's," I said. "It matters." What I didn't tell him: the property was worth over $300,000. Lakefront land in the Adirondacks had skyrocketed in value. And according to New York estate law, if a property was improperly excluded from probate, the oversight could be challenged, even a decade later. I hired a private investigator, a retired NYPD detective named Frank Rossi. I gave him one job: document everything about my family's finances over the past 10 years. What Frank found was stunning. David had used Dad's estate, nearly $800,000 after the sale of the Rochester house, to start a restaurant in Syracuse. It failed within 3 years. He'd burned through $400,000. Christine had invested in a multi-level marketing scheme, losing another $150,000. Mom had been moved into a nursing home in Pittsford, her care funded by what remained of the estate. But the facility was filing complaints. Payments were irregular. Uncle Carl, the trustee, had taken substantial management fees. Over $60,000 in 10 years. And all of it, every transaction, every decision, had been made without proper oversight because I, the only other legal heir, had been deliberately excluded from notifications. In New York, that's called breach of fiduciary duty. I spent year 8 consulting with a specialist in estate fraud at a Manhattan firm. She reviewed everything. "Michael," she said, looking up from the documents, "they made every mistake possible. Improper exclusion of an heir, mismanagement of assets, failure to disclose property, excessive fees. You could invalidate the entire probate. And then it reopens. And you, as the surviving son, have equal claim, possibly greater, given their mismanagement." I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. But I waited. I had to be sure. Year 9, I quietly filed a motion with the Suigat's Court in Monroe County to reopen my father's estate. I didn't tell anyone. I used a lawyer from Buffalo, someone my family wouldn't recognize. The motion cited failure to notify legal heir, improper exclusion, undisclosed assets, and mismanagement. The court scheduled a hearing for 14 months later. I continued my life as if nothing had changed. I went to work. I had dinner with colleagues. I dated occasionally, though nothing serious. Kept my routine. But every night I reviewed the case file. Every document. Every signature. Every lie. I remembered Dorothy's words. The law doesn't care about feelings. Cares about documentation. I had 10 years of documentation. And they had 10 years of careless mistakes. The hearing notice went out in April of year 10. It was sent to my mother's nursing home, to David's last known address, to Christine's suburban house in Henrietta, and to Carl's law office. I imagine the moment they opened those envelopes. I imagine the panic. Because after a decade of silence, I was no longer the abandoned son. I was the heir they'd forgotten. And I was coming for what was mine. The Monroe County Circuit's Court sits on Exchange Boulevard in downtown Rochester, a limestone building that's seen a century of family disputes. On a clear morning in late April, I walked up those steps for the first time in 10 years, carrying a leather briefcase Dorothy had given me when I passed the bar. "For when you need to look like you mean business," she'd said. I meant business. Inside, the hallways echoed with the soft murmur of lawyers and their clients, hushed conversations about wills, trusts, guardianships, the machinery of inheritance. I found courtroom 3 and paused outside the door. Through the small window I could see them. Mom in a wheelchair now, her face thinner than I remembered. Christine beside her, wearing an expensive-looking blazer that probably came from what was left of Dad's money. David, heavier, older, his face red and anxious. And Uncle Carl, gray-haired and stern, sitting at the respondent's table with 2 junior attorneys from his firm. They hadn't seen me yet. I pushed open the door. Christine noticed first. Her eyes went wide. She grabbed Mom's hand, whispering urgently. David turned, and for a moment we locked eyes. I saw shock, then anger, then something like fear. Carl remained impassive but his jaw tightened. I walked to the petitioner's table and sat down beside my attorney, Linda Reeves, a specialist in estate litigation from Buffalo. She'd come highly recommended and her reputation preceded her. She didn't lose. "Ready," she whispered. "More than ready." The judge entered. Honorable Patricia Corrigan, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for cutting through family drama with surgical precision. We all stood. "Be seated," Judge Corrigan said, reviewing the case file. Estate of Robert Michael Harrison, deceased April 2014. Petitioner Michael Harrison seeks to reopen probate on grounds of improper exclusion, undisclosed assets and mismanagement. "Mr. Harrison," she looked at Carl, "you represented the estate as trustee?" Carl stood. "Yes, Your Honor. And I'd like to state for the record that this petition is a vindictive attempt by a family member who abandoned." "I'll determine what this is, Counselor," Judge Corrigan interrupted. "Sit down." Carl sat. Linda stood. "Your Honor, will demonstrate 3 critical failures in the original probate. First, my client was deliberately excluded from notification despite being a legal heir. Second, a property valued at over $300,000 was omitted from the estate inventory. Third, over $500,000 in assets were mismanaged through questionable investments and excessive trustee fees." Judge Corrigan turned to Carl. "Is there a response to the exclusion claim?" One of Carl's junior attorneys stood. "Your Honor, Michael Harrison had voluntarily separated from the family years before the decedent's death. There was no obligation." "There's every obligation," Judge Corrigan said sharply. "New York law requires notification of all legal heirs, regardless of family disputes. Was Mr. Harrison notified of his father's death?" Silence. "Was he invited to the funeral?" More silence. "Was he sent copies of the estate filing?" Carl finally spoke. "Your Honor, we believed he'd waived his interest." "On what legal basis?" "His absence." Judge Corrigan removed her glasses. "Absence is not waiver, Mr. Harrison. You're an attorney. You know this." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Linda presented every document I'd gathered. The Lake George property deed. The tax payments I'd made. The private investigator's report on David's failed restaurant and Christine's losses. Bank statements showing Carl's fees. And then the piece of evidence that changed everything. Linda projected a document onto the courtroom screen. Dad's original will, dated 2010. "Your Honor, this will predates the 2014 probate by 4 years. In it, Robert Harrison explicitly names his son Michael as equal beneficiary with his other children. He also designates Michael as successor trustee should his brother Carl be unable or unwilling to serve." The room went silent. "The will submitted to probate in 2014, Linda continued, was dated 3 months before Mr. Harrison's death. My client was never shown this newer will. He had no opportunity to contest it. And notably, it was witnessed by the 2 individuals who benefited most from my client's exclusion, David Harrison and Christine Harrison." Judge Corrigan looked at Carl. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Carl stood slowly. "Your Honor, the 2014 will reflected the decedent's wishes at the time of his death. He chose." "Was Michael Harrison present when his father signed this will?" "No." "Was he informed it existed?" "No." "Was there any documentation that Robert Harrison wanted to exclude his son?" Carl hesitated. His condition at the time was deteriorating. Alzheimer's. "We believed." "You believed," Judge Corrigan said coldly, "that you could exploit a dying man's cognitive decline to rewrite his estate in favor of your family. Is that what you're telling this court?" The words hung in the air. Christine started crying. Mom stared at her lap. David looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Defeat. Judge Corrigan made her ruling from the bench. "The 2014 probate is void. The estate of Robert Harrison is hereby reopened under the terms of his 2010 will. Michael Harrison is named successor trustee, effective immediately. All parties will submit to a full accounting of assets, expenditures and current holdings within 60 days. She looked directly at Carl. "Mr. Harrison, I'm referring your conduct to the State Bar for investigation. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. I sat there not moving as my family filed out. Christine wouldn't look at me. David muttered something under his breath. Mom's wheelchair stopped briefly beside my table. She looked at me, her eyes wet. "Michael," she whispered. I said nothing. She was wheeled away. Linda put her hand on my shoulder. "You did it." But I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. Outside on the courthouse steps, David confronted me. "You happy now?" he spat. "You got what you wanted. You destroyed this family. I looked at him, really looked at him. The expensive watch was gone. Probably sold. He looked tired. Beaten. I didn't destroy anything, I said quietly. You did that 10 years ago when you decided I didn't matter. When you erased me from Dad's funeral. When you forged his will. We didn't. Yes, you did. And now you're going to face the consequences. I walked away, down Exchange Boulevard into the April sunshine. For the first time in 10 years I felt something like peace. The accounting took 3 months. As successor trustee I had access to everything. Bank statements, investment records, receipts, contracts. Linda and I worked with a forensic accountant to trace every dollar from Dad's original estate. What we found was worse than I'd imagined. Of the $800,000, less than $150,000 remained. Most of it was in Mom's care account at the Pittsford nursing facility. The rest had evaporated through David's failed ventures, Christine's pyramid schemes and Carl's fees. The Lake George property which I'd saved, was now the estate's most valuable asset. In July, I drove back to Rochester for the final settlement conference. This time there was no courtroom drama. Just a conference room in Linda's law office, with my family seated across a table, their own lawyers beside them. Carl wasn't there. He'd been suspended by the state bar pending investigation. Judge Corrigan had appointed a mediator, a retired judge named Arthur Brennan, known for his fairness. Let's be clear, Brennan said, opening the meeting. Michael Harrison is now the trustee. He controls the estate. But there are still 3 heirs, Michael, David, and Christine. The question is how to divide what remains. Linda laid out our position. My client is entitled to full restitution for his exclusion, plus damages for the breach of fiduciary duty. Conservatively, that's $400,000, half the original estate he was denied. David's lawyer spoke up. Your Honor, that's not realistic. The money's gone. Our clients can't pay that. Then, Linda said calmly, we proceed to a full litigation, seek personal liability judgments and attach any remaining assets, including the proceeds from the Lake George property, which will be sold to satisfy the judgment. Christine started crying again. Michael, please. Mom has nothing. We have nothing. I looked at her. Really looked at her. She'd aged. They all had. Mom looked frail. David looked broken. They weren't the powerful, dismissive family that had excluded me. They were just tired people who'd made terrible choices. Can I speak? I asked Brennan. He nodded. I took a breath. 10 years ago you treated me like I didn't exist. You excluded me from Dad's funeral. You took everything he'd built and wasted it on schemes and fees and selfishness. You didn't just hurt me, you dishonored him. Mom looked up. Michael. Let me finish. My voice was steady. For 10 years I rebuilt my life. I became someone Dad would have been proud of. I learned the law. I worked hard. I didn't need your approval or your money. I survived without you. David's jaw tightened. But here's the thing, I continued. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because what you did was wrong. And someone needed to make it right. I looked at Linda. She nodded. So here's my proposal, I said. The Lake George property is worth $300,000. I'm keeping it. It was grandfather's, it should have been mine, and I saved it when you forgot it existed. The remaining $150,000 in Mom's care account stays for her medical expenses. That's non-negotiable. What about us? David asked bitterly. You. I leaned forward. You get nothing from the estate. But I'm not going to sue you personally. I'm not going to attach your homes or garnish your wages. I'm walking away. You'll have to live with what you did, but I won't spend the rest of my life punishing you for it. Christine sobbed. Thank you. Don't thank me, I said. Just understand what you lost. Not the money, you lost 10 years of having a brother. You lost the chance to grieve Dad together. You lost a family member because you chose greed over love. That's on you. The settlement was signed that afternoon. I became the sole owner of the Lake George property and trustee of Mom's care fund. David and Christine signed releases, acknowledging they'd received their inheritance and mismanaged it. As we left the conference room, Mom's wheelchair stopped beside me one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered. Your father would be so ashamed of us. I knelt down so we were eye level. He would be. But he'd also want you taken care of. The nursing home payments will continue. You'll be okay. Will you? She hesitated. Will you visit? I thought about it. About 10 years of silence. About the funeral I wasn't invited to. About the family that erased me. Maybe, I said finally. Someday. When I'm ready. I stood and walked out. 6 months later, I drove to Lake George on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 10 years after Dad's funeral. The autumn leaves were spectacular, brilliant reds and golds reflecting off the dark water. I'd spent the summer renovating grandfather's cabin. New roof. Updated plumbing. Solar panels. It would never be luxurious, but it was mine. I stood on the dock, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. My phone buzzed. A text from David. Christine told me what you did for Mom. Thank you. I didn't reply. Another text, this time from an unknown number. Mr. Harrison, this is Sarah Chin from the New York State Bar. Your testimony helped conclude our investigation into Carl Harrison. Thank you for your cooperation. I smiled slightly. The law doesn't care about feelings, Dorothy had said. Cares about documentation. But sometimes justice and feelings align. I never got revenge. I never needed to. I'd simply waited, learned, and let their own mistakes catch up to them. And in the end, I got something more valuable than money. I got to become someone my father would have been proud of. Someone who understood that the best inheritance isn't wealth. It's integrity. I finished my coffee and went inside. There was work to do. I was converting part of the cabin into a small legal aid office, offering free estate planning to families like mine, families torn apart by greed and poor decisions. Dad's watch, the real one, not the fake Rolex David had worn, sat on the mantel. I'd found it in a safe deposit box that only I, as trustee, had access to. Dad had left it specifically for me with a note. Michael, this was my father's. Now it's yours. Not because you're the oldest or the favorite, but because you're the one who'll understand what it means. Time is the most valuable thing we have. Don't waste it on anger. Love, Dad. I wouldn't. Outside, the lake sparkled in the morning sun, and for the first time in a decade, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. I felt home.